institutions behind this new age stupidity. Some of our top learning institutions, you mentioned Harvard, they're filled with dogmatic certainties about the past and present, and so much of the ills that we seem to see in society had their roots in academia.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was at Harvard and MIT the other day, and, you know, there's a row going on because a recent president of the college ordered an inquiry into the extent to which Harvard might have benefited from the slave trade and what Harvard's involvement was and this sort of thing.
The evidence of the legacy of slavery at Harvard is in the landscape. You can go to the old burial ground and you can see the headstones for 2 enslaved people. One of them, a girl named Cicely, was enslaved to William Brattle, who was a tutor, a treasurer, and a fellow at Harvard University.
We also know that several of Harvard's presidents who lived in Wadsworth House, which is still standing on campus today, owned enslaved people of African origins, among them Venus, Bilah, and Juba.
Titus also is someone who was enslaved on Harvard's campus, and he is believed to have been of indigenous and possibly also of African descent.
The New England economy was very much tied to slavery in the South and slavery in the Caribbean as well. That's really the Harvard story.
Well, there's a very large monument in the center of Harvard to the Harvard students who died fighting in the armies of the North and gave their lives up in a war that abolished slavery. So that's Harvard's legacy of slavery, actually. The most prominent legacy is the legacy of abolishing it, and all of these students giving up their lives for this cause.
In an 18th century plantation house, still standing just a couple of miles from Harvard's campus. This was the home of the Royals, Isaac Royal Sr. and his son, Isaac Royal Jr.
The Royals are a good example of Harvard's entanglement with the institution of slavery.
The Royals made their money off sugar plantations in the island of Antigua, but it wasn't easy money.
In 1736, Antigua's plantation owners became fearful that enslaved workers were plotting against them, and they decided to crack down.
The royal family was involved in putting down this slave uprising. A lot of head chopping, decapitations to make people as examples, burning people.
Then Isaac Royal Sr. migrated back to New England, to his huge property, several hundred acres of land. He brought enslaved workers from the Caribbean to Medford to work. Eventually, Isaac Royal Jr. donates lands to Harvard University, which the university then sells and uses to endow the first professorship of law at Harvard University. So in many ways, the origins of one of the world's greatest law schools, namely Harvard Law School, is directly to be found in the exploitation of enslaved workers on the sugar plantations of Antigua.
And Isaac Royal was just one of many donors to the university who made their money, at least in part through slavery and the slave trade. So money derived from slave labor contributed to Harvard. But Harvard also produced and advanced some of the racist ideas that underpinned the system of slavery and justified segregation and racial subjugation long after slavery ended.
One of the most influential race scientists at Harvard was a man named Louis Agassiz.
Louis Agassiz came to Harvard in 1847 from Switzerland, where he had made a reputation for himself as a person studying comparative anatomy. A major question at the time was, how do we understand human variation? How do we understand that some groups have dark skin, some groups have lighter skin?
Agassiz becomes one of the major progenitors of the theory of polygenesis. the notion that human races are actually separate species, and God, rather than creating humanity in one moment, i.e. Adam and Eve, created 5 different Adam and Eves.
Agassi argued that there were major anatomical, physiological, intellectual differences between human groups, that white Americans/Europeans were at the top of a hierarchy, and Africans, dark-skinned, black-skinned peoples were at the bottom.
The story of Stormon, of a black man from Southern Africa, reminds us of how tragedy was at the bottom of racial science.
It's such a horrible story. 2 American men went to Southern Africa. They ended up bringing back 5 men from different tribes here to Boston, having them displayed, dressed in quote-unquote native garb. Come and see these interesting, very, very different people.
These 5 men are put on display at the Aquarial Gardens. They were supposed to hold their spears and beads and sing songs for gawking audience members.
Among these men was a young man whose name we now pronounce Stormon.
Stormon is a particularly tragic figure. He's only 17 years old. At the end of about 6 months to a year of being on display, he takes his own life. He hangs himself. But Stormon's tragedy doesn't end with his death. When Stormon kills himself, they give his body to Harvard.
Harvard faculty member Jeffries Wyman conducted a dissection of Stormon's body, and they also made a set of casts of his body that remains in the Harvard Peabody Museum collections.
His skeleton is turned into a teaching tool. They say it's left in the care, what irony, of Professor Louis Agassiz. Stormon is measured and put in a linear position anatomically between whites and great apes. So not only is his body being destroyed, he's also being turned into this point of data to prove his own inferiority.
Again, it just gets lost. And no one seems to care about what we used to call the facts or the context. It's extremely alarming because it means that very didactic people, like the authors of the 1619 Project and others, can come up with tiny little factoids that they've Googled and totally ignore the monuments and the story and the actual facts of an entire nation's history.